Hi, welcome to our COTS Walk panel today. My name is Becky Holt, and I will be our facilitator. I am very excited to have three of our direct service staff join us today, Emily, Fiona, and Jasmine, who all work in different aspects of COTS with single adults and with families and children. So they're going to talk a little bit about their experience today, and we're going to discuss some themes that they see that are similar to their work and also unique to their unique programs at COTS. Also, we will, hopefully many of you have watched in advance of this, the Frontline documentary, Growing Up Poor in America, which will have some themes about the time of homelessness and COVID. So we'll be talking about some of those themes as well. So without further ado, I'd love to have each of them introduce themselves. So Emily, if you'd like to get started and tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do at COTS and how long you've worked here.
Of course. Thank you so much, Becky. I'm really happy to be here today. So my name is Emily Sikorsky. I am the assistant coordinator at the COTS Way Station. That is our shelter for single adults. I've been at that shelter for I think 2 months shy of 3 years now, but the first year was direct service, like staff level, and then I got promoted to the assistant coordinator position for the last 2 years.
Nice. Thank you so much, Emily. Jasmine, tell us a little bit about your role at COTS.
Hi, I'm Jasmine. I am a housing navigator for single adults within the Housing Resource Center, which we call the HRC. And that kind of is the umbrella term for the financial assistance team and the housing navigation team. And I've worked at COTS for almost a year now.
Welcome. Thank you so much for being here, Jasmine. Fiona, tell us a little bit about your role.
Hi, everyone. My name is Fiona Maharan. I am the Children's Education Advocate at COTS Family Shelter. So my primary job responsibility is to ensure that children and families experiencing homelessness have an awareness and access to resources to provide them with equitable access to education. So that means as soon as they come into shelter, we are enrolling them in school and making sure that they are equipped with childcare subsidies and affordable quality healthcare.
Nice, thank you so much. So I'm going to go back a little round robin again. So Emily, describe, if you don't mind, a typical day for you at COTS and what it would look like in your role here at COTS.
Yeah, so I would say it's really hard to say that there is a typical day at a shelter just because everything is always changing. And, we all know there's a lot going on in the world right now that also is adding extra changes on top of that. If I had to reduce it to its most basic aspects, though, it's a lot of working one-on-one with guests, signing them in, getting them oriented to the space, kind of acting as a go-between and a sympathetic ear to help them kind of figure out like where they are in their process, what's going on, what their next steps are, and then helping them also get connected to the other parts of the organization, like the HRC and other aspects that they might need.
Nice. So tell me a little, Emily, just a little bit more. So in non-COVID times, what does the way station look like, and what is it like? What's the layout, and what changes have you made in the time of COVID?
Yeah, so the way that it used to look is we would have 36 beds and we'd have 36 guests for those. We'd also have 4 slots for emergencies for people who didn't realize that they needed a space and then suddenly needed one, for example. The setup is that we have a front lobby area, the office, the entryway. There is an area for guests to sit down, a phone for them to use. You go further in the building, there are the 2 separate dorms, which are divided into the men's dorm and the women's dorm. And then downstairs, you have a common area with a washer, a dryer, a place to eat, a place to watch TV, just basically like a little living room setup. Since COVID, that's a pretty big question, especially reflecting a year back. There's a lot of changes we've made along the way. A lot of it, the biggest one first, we've cut our capacity. Right now, we have a maximum of 15 beds. We also have started doing daily health screenings and temperature checks. We've encouraged social distancing by changing the layout so the space downstairs can still be used. There's more distance between the chairs, between the tables, so that people can be safe. Mm-hmm. We also ask that everyone use hand sanitizer, they wear masks, and all of those COVID procedures.
Wow, thank you. Thank you so much. I have one more question that when we give tours at the way station that sometimes come up. Do you, how do you address people with gender, like, with gender questions that come up? So how do we serve all, is COTS welcome to everyone?
Yes, yes, it is open to everyone, regardless of identity, orientation, creed, any of those other categories. Everyone is welcome. We do have a conversation with people who let us know that that's a concern of theirs, and we work with them to help find the best dorm to suit their needs and their comfort.
Thank you. Thank you. So Jasmine, I'll ask you the same question. So is there a typical day for you at COTS, and what does it look like? And you started during COVID, correct? Is that?
Yeah. So I've actually worked here, the entire time. But I did case management very similarly in Utah, where I lived before.
Okay.
But yeah, so for case management, I would say that one of the positives would be that it's a very flexible and ever-changing position. So I wouldn't say that there's any one day where I do the same thing every day, which I enjoy. But you have to remain flexible because, most of your day is based off of clients. And obviously, experiencing homelessness is a tumultuous period for most folks. So it's, you have to keep in mind that, if they don't make a meeting, it's not the end of the world. So just keeping flexible is kind of the thing I try to keep in mind when I start every day. But I'd say generally I start, checking my emails, reading the log from the shelter. Usually have to remind clients of meetings that we have later in the day to try to avoid, them forgetting. And then, usually the day is filled with kind of 1 hour blocks, meeting with clients who are both staying at the way station. And then also right now, because of COVID, I have a small caseload of folks who are living in motels that are paid for by economic services right now. So kind of just 1 hour chunks throughout the day with folks who are in both settings. Some of them are in my office. Sometimes I will go to wherever they're at. So, I've gone to like coffee shops before, their apartments, the motels. I try to just stay flexible so that, I can meet them where they're at, wherever that is. And then, there's also the, kind of weekly meetings I go to, which is, we have a coordinated entry meeting, which is with a lot of community partners, adult interagency meetings, COTS specific housing retention meetings. So in addition to kind of having a caseload of folks who are, actively homeless, I also have a retention load of people who were formerly homeless who live in either COTS buildings or buildings out in the community. So I guess I would say most of my caseload is retention, but I work most regularly with the folks who are actively homeless. But yeah, and in addition to that, just, keeping up on case notes and spreadsheets and Excels. And, and then, yeah.
Let me touch back on a couple of things you brought up that just to explain for people who may not be familiar with. Can you tell our audience a little bit about what coordinated entry is?
Yeah, so coordinated entry is essentially a mechanism that I think I would assume most cities and states have implemented now. We used it back where I worked in Utah as well, where community partners and housing providers will all come to a meeting, and community organizations like myself and COTS will say, these are our clients who are actively homeless, these are their needs. This is their vulnerability score, which we'll calculate with them. And then housing providers will come and they'll say, we have this unit at this location, we have this unit that's subsidized at this location. And then, the leader of coordinated entry will determine this is how we're going to prioritize folks for this unit. So we're going to look at folks who have been, homeless the longest. So people who are chronically homeless. We're going to look at people who have the higher vulnerability scores. And then in addition to that, people who fit, if they need a subsidy or if they have enough income to afford a market rate unit. So we will kind of prioritize based off of that. So we have the master list of, ideally, probably not actually, but every person that is experiencing homelessness in the area would ideally be in coordinated entry so that they can be prioritized for the unit that is appropriate for them, so that we're not having the most vulnerable people continuing to not be able to access units. And so we don't just kind of have everyone running around, trying to scramble and apply to the same unit when we can just pick, this is the person we're referring to this unit they're the most appropriate and the most in need. So we have that meeting. It's like 2.5 hours every Monday. But it's definitely one of the, more important parts of my job, I'd say.
Thank you. And so Jasmine, I mean, a lot of the stuff that you're working, I apologize, I'm making you keep talking. So I'll give you, well, actually, I'll give you a break. I'll come back to some things on the next round. So Fiona, tell us a little bit about what is, again, I think you also started during COVID. Is that correct? Or did you start right before the pandemic?
I started COTS when in the early stages of the pandemic, when we were still sort of problem solving and figuring out how to approach school and remote learning and school closures and how to maintain access, which looked really different for children experiencing homelessness. Remote learning looks different in shelter, or it looks different if you're learning if you're in a motel. So yeah, my job really began as
challenging time.
What was that?
At a challenging time. I mean,
yeah, and a time to really
but yeah.
creative, and I feel like it facilitated sort of this direct like motivation to invest in relationship building with community partners and put our heads together and find solutions and identify barriers. And so my role in the beginning was really a lot of conversations with families who, as a product of homelessness, that with children who already were facing a level of learning loss and displacement, and having conversations about how is remote learning going, what are the barriers, and then helping to relay that information to sort of like the deciding bodies of figuring out how remote learning was going to look. So a lot of advocacy around 4 days in-person learning for children experiencing homelessness, and then creating strategies in shelter in order to for the Wednesday remote learning day, finding ways to help children access remote learning. So we were able to access some grant money to revamp our playroom, create a more sort of trauma-informed multi-purpose learning space, but also play space in order to get a break from all of the transitions and chaos. And then, the purchase of like foldable desks that could be stored away that children could bring out and use in various spaces. And
wow. So
yeah.
it's been a lot. So so tell me a little bit about with the remote learning and with some of the changes in shelter. What are some of the struggles that you've seen families and children handling? I'm sure they're very similar to other families who've been balancing remote learning and all of this upheaval, but not with the added component of being in a shelter. So what has that been like for the families and children you've been working with?
Yeah, I think that the unique barriers are numerous. It logistically, just space is a big one. Internet access is a big one, especially if there are multiple children who are needing to access their remote learning classroom and stream video all at the same time. And one family in particular, one of their children was expressing somewhat of a shame response, accessing his remote classroom in a bedroom that he shared with his whole family. And then another child who was really struggling. He was in 100% remote learning and was just really struggling. It did not meet his learning style whatsoever. And we ended up coordinating a meeting with his principal and his guidance counselor and his teachers and his parent, who was incredible, such an inspiring advocate for her son. And they were really able to problem solve and bring him back to school. So a lot of it has looked like, how can we get these kids back to school? How can we provide transportation as it's needed? And all of the coordination that goes into that.
Thank you. Thank you, Fiona. So, so I'm going to kind of go back around, and this is kind of a nice segue from what Fiona was just talking about back to Emily. So what are describe some of the challenges that you see? Like, what is something the general public wouldn't know or wouldn't expect about the people who are facing homelessness in Burlington, Vermont?
Yeah, I think that is a very difficult question to answer, because a brief summary of that answer is like everything is a challenge. There are so many aspects that for people who haven't experienced it don't even stick out to us. One, for example, I know that came up a lot when the pandemic started for guests that were coming to shelter, were staying in shelter, is when everything shut down, there was nowhere for them to go during the day. So everyone was being told, stay home, stay safe. But even the phrasing like stay home, people who are experiencing homelessness don't have a home to stay in. So I think a large summary of the answer is that pretty much everything that we have set up is with the expectation that people have somewhere to go that is safe and accessible to them at all times. And that is not the reality everyone faces.
Thank you, Emily. You're absolutely right. So Jasmine, the same question to you. What are some, is there anything you would add or suggestions from that?
Yeah, no, I mean, I definitely agree with Emily. I've heard a lot of the same sentiments just surrounding, people not having those, obviously the primary spaces being, your home, but also not really those, secondary spaces of like, a coffee shop or a bookstore, or, the library. That's made it, really difficult for folks, experiencing homelessness and not really having anywhere to go during the day. Specifically during the winter too. But I would also add that, for us, it's easy to think, about kind of the more broad scale kind of public health emergency. I'm going to follow COVID precautions to protect not just myself, but also, my community and my neighbors. And I would say for people experiencing homelessness, they're in a constant state of emergency, essentially. So kind of thinking of those hierarchy of needs. If you don't have anywhere to sleep or you're worried about where you're going to get your next meal, it's harder for I would say my clients to be able to kind of imagine like thinking about other people or their community, or like, oh, I should put my mask on because that person could be, immunocompromised. I would say like when you're in a state of emergency, it's difficult to be thinking of other people because, you're constantly in red alert. It causes you to think, I guess, in a little bit more like selfish way, but not in, a negative connotation, because obviously, it's fight or flight response. So it is hard to have those conversations with people like, you should get the vaccine because, it can protect you and everyone else at shelter. When people are experiencing this kind of, level of trauma, it's hard for them to think outwardly kind of on a more grand scale. Yeah, that's something that I've noticed though.
Yeah, that's that scarcity, fight or flight mentality. And yeah, absolutely. Fiona, thoughts from the family perspective, similar, I'm sure, but also there are unique things that you see in families.
Yeah, I think that just in adding to what Jasmine's describing, that hierarchy of needs, when you add in the needs of your children, it sometimes that takes precedent over housing even, and lack of childcare has been a cause of homelessness for a lot of families during this time, especially where the employment landscape has been more and more challenging for folks to access. And so oftentimes, that hierarchy of needs and that state of emergency and crisis and destabilization, access to childcare can really take center stage. And that's oftentimes like a first step toward stabilization. And I think one thing that's been really highlighted, particularly during the pandemic, in relation to children experiencing homelessness is the role of school and how school plays a really primary role in prevention. School is food security, it is shelter, it is connection, it's learning, it's play, it's all of these things that contribute to a child's well-being, their sense of safety and consistency, which during a time of crisis is really valuable. And I think that particularly in the Burlington School District, the teachers and school personnel and everyone have really recognized that and really come together to, even through the pandemic, even through school closures, to make sure that children still have access to food. And it's like an all hands on deck effort. You know, we have individual teachers coming to deliver boxes of food that are kind of curated by the chefs in the cafeteria, which are like, we live in Vermont, it's like fresh veggies from the farm, and meals that you know, frozen meals that but that are like homemade, and raw ingredients. And so that's really been a critical resource for us, because we're already dependent on emergency food centers and community partners. Oftentimes families come into shelter and they don't have three squares or immediate access to food resources. And so it's a lot of, you know, helping them to learn where those locations are. But yeah, I think that has been something that has really stood out to me during this time, is all of the sort of unspoken behind the scenes support that school offers that is imperative. Yeah.
No, that's
really, really thankful for our teachers.
Yeah. No, thank you. You're absolutely right, Fiona. I mean, I think all of you touched on things that in, you know, the decade I've worked for COTS, I learned how much I took for granted, things that I didn't even realize were, you know, I thought, oh, I have these blessings in my life. I have these things that make my life easier. And then when I came to COTS, I realized I had like thousands of more things that I didn't even realize were important, you know, healthcare, teeth care, you know, access to a shower and a haircut and clean clothes and a mailbox and food. And, you know, there was so many, like you said, a place to go and something to do. I mean, I think that's one of the things that I learned when I first came to COTS, when, you know, there's chores, you know, for guests in shelter and chores for at the day station. And, you know, it was pointed out that having something to do to be useful is really an important, you know, value, as well as those rhythms of life, you know, carving pumpkins, you know, picking apples. Those are things that keep you connected to community and to your humanity, and to remember how important that is when everything else is in turmoil, that those are your touchstones. And I realized how important things that I never thought of as valuable in my life were really valuable. And I see that because you see people who don't have those things and you didn't even realize you had them. So, oh, thank you for sharing that. So back to Emily, what's an experience that you've had or a moment you've witnessed at COTS that continues to resonate for you and you'd like to share?
Yeah. So I have one experience that actually happened very soon after I started working here, which is, I think, probably why it stood out the most to me. So there was a guest who, by the time I had started, had already done his final application to apartments, was moving in, was ready to go. So he was just there for like 1 week until his lease started. He'd been there for months before I started, but it was just 1 week where he and I were there at the same time. He came back months later and was like, hey, I just wanted to let you know I'm doing great. It's been awesome. Thank you so much for all of your help. I really appreciate it. Like, keep on being there. People need you. They need people who are happy to be there, to see them, to help them. That's what got me through. And I just remember being so struck by it because I'd only met him 1 week. That was the only time I knew him. I didn't do any of the work, but I was the person who said hello to him each day when he came in, and I was the one he remembered. So he still will stop by once in a while, and it's always really great to see him. He checks in less often now, but it has also been 3 years and a pandemic, so it's understandable.
No, that's amazing, Emily. You're absolutely right. That warm human interaction is really important and valuable. So Jasmine, do you have an experience like that, or something that sticks with you, positive, negative, or otherwise, that resonates for you?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, every day there's, the small ones. I would say for case management, they're, you're able to really see the everyday impact. Like, we applied for 3 squares for food stamps, and they get approved, and then suddenly they have money for food. Or, we applied to Medicaid, and finally they can go get their knee checked. That's been hurting them for months. So it's kind of nice to be able to see those, have those everyday wins and be able to see them, right in front of you. But I'd say something that was a little bit more, that resonated a little bit more with me. We had a client who was staying at the way station. He was probably there for maybe 4 or 5 months. He had, kind of similarly to a lot of my clients, traveled across the US and been homeless in, many different states, which to him, he really enjoyed because he got to explore and, live in many different places and have a lot of different experiences. And he somehow made his way to Vermont. And so after doing his quarantine at the local motel that we have homeless folks quarantine at, he came to shelter. And we were actually able to find him a unit that was subsidized, and it was open for him at our Wilson building. So it's right next to the shelter. It's called the Wilson Hotel. So I was able to move him in there, and he was, really excited. He had been homeless for 7 years consistently beforehand. And he sent me a text after he moved in. I'll read the text. So he said, I think Steve is the landlord. He said, I think Steve asked me how I liked it, and I couldn't quite put it into words. I just said, I love it. The thing is, I had been without housing for so long, I kind of forgot that it's called a necessity for a reason, and I still can't quite describe this feeling. So I think that specifically resonated with me. Not, I've moved plenty of people into housing and they've been very grateful. But I think that this one stuck out a little bit more, just because he acknowledged that, it had been so long that he had been housed, and he had camped for, 7 years, been outside, not connected to any services, that he had forgotten. To us, it's like, I can't even imagine, one night would be so traumatic without shelter. But, after 7 years, he had forgotten what it was even like to be housed. So I think just reading that, I thought it was really great.
Yeah, that's really, yeah, you got me. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that, Jasmine. Fiona, how about you? Is there a story or a moment that really sticks out for you that you keep coming back to? Oh, you're unmuted. You're muted. So.
Yeah, a number of them do. It's oftentimes themes of like witnessing parent advocacy and feeling just overwhelmingly inspired by seeing parents advocate for their children while under so much, while in that state of crisis, and still feeling empowered to do so. And I think that I really do keep coming back to that one moment that I mentioned earlier about a mom who was just tirelessly advocating for her special needs child, who had very unique learning needs, who remote learning wasn't an option. It was kind of a non-negotiable, and she was very firm in advocating for his needs. And, when his teachers were like, well, what if we adapted in this way? And what if we, it's like, nope, not going to work. This is what my child needs. I know my child, and you know, these are the resources that we need to provide. And then on the flip side of that, you know, really seeing the teachers like approach that conversation with an open mind, and really putting the parent's voice, and the student was present for this meeting too, and just really putting their needs center stage and really listening, and using all of the available resources in order to accommodate that, and doing so in a way that was just like, you know, people were excited, you know, welcome back to school.
Yeah.
And that was just really fun to see. Oh, and since we're sharing quotes,
Yeah.
I do remember at the end just congratulating her and sharing my admiration for her advocacy. And she goes, "I'm just being a parent."
Pretty awesome parent, I would say.
Yeah.
That's awesome. No, I'm always, you know, thank you. You know, the stories that you've shared are similar to stories I've heard from, you know, in a decade at COTS, and they're just amazing, because it's those human connections, that reminder, and that how we can get disconnected, and so how we, and relationship with each other, and what that means. So thank you for sharing that. So to kind of build on that, why this work, Emily? What draws you to COTS and keeps it meaningful to you? Because it's not easy. It's not easy. So.
Yeah. So I have kind of two answers to that. One is like why helping people in general, and then one is why specifically COTS.
Mhm.
So in general, I pretty early on, for a reason I'll explain in a moment, made it part of my core life philosophy to leave the world a better place than it was when I entered it. So to that end, pretty early on in my life, I figured out that meant helping people, and helping people in the most vulnerable positions. The reason why COTS in particular is because as a child, I actually experienced homelessness myself. I didn't come to the COTS family shelter. I never had anything to do with COTS, but I remember the feeling of being homeless. I remember being a child who had nowhere to go. And I remember the people at the shelter I was at, and how helpful they were, and how it made the entire difference for my family. And that was the moment where I was like, that's what I want to do.
Thank you, Emily. I didn't know that. Thank you for sharing that. That's beautiful. Jasmine, how about you? What makes the work meaningful and keeps you engaged, and why COTS?
Well, I personally have always felt that, you know, I believe housing is a human right. And, you know, just knowing that, you know, on every given day, there's, you know, over 500,000 family, or, you know, not families, but individuals and families experiencing homelessness, you know, within our country. It's hard for me to imagine, you know, a space where we're able to continue progressing and flourishing while leaving so many people behind. And, you know, it's not just a stagnant 500,000. It's, you know, it fluctuates day to day. There are people coming in and out constantly. And I, you know, personally believe that, you know, we need to transform these systems and processes that, you know, are leading to this, you know, extraordinary disparity in, you know, wealth and resources before we're able to really, you know, move forward as a nation. And then, you know, looking more on a micro scale, I really enjoy interacting with folks who are, you know, very different from myself, very different from the way that I was raised. It's very entertaining, I would say, on the day-to-day, exciting, you know, sad, you know, heartbreaking, but inspiring. I would say it's certainly not a boring job. And then COTS specifically, you know, I mean, I think that they do a really good job of, or I guess we do a great job of, you know, exhibiting our passion for, you know, addressing homelessness in multiple facets. It's not just, you know, we have a shelter, we have multiple shelters, we have buildings, we have transitional housing programs, we have financial aid department. It's not just like we're trying to fix homelessness by, only operating in one way, because I don't think that that is how we will be able to solve homelessness. It's going to take, an extraordinary amount of effort in kind of all different sectors. So I think that that's something that COTS does, really well within the community.
No, thank you. Thank you. And Fiona, how about you? I mean, working with families and children in shelter, I know none of these jobs are easy. So why COTS, and what keeps you engaged in this work?
Yeah. I think I also have two answers, kind of like personally and professionally. And so personally, I think that I come to this work in many ways by way of an experience of growing up with a brother who is deaf, and with learning differences, and experiencing having different access to education, and a disparity within my own family. And I'm coming back to parent advocacy, and now I'm kind of like, oh, maybe that's why. Just seeing my mom just fight for him, and really dedicate her life's work to ensuring that children and families had language access and equitable access to education, and really focusing on autonomy, and providing families and children with the tools to have agency to access services and community and resources independently. So that's sort of my personal motivation. And then professionally, I think, so prior to COTS, I was working in treatment for children experiencing mental health crisis. And I was really interested in kind of like taking a step back in time and working more in prevention. And I really was noticing the role of school, and how, and the strength of school as a support system, and as a really critical player in the preventative side of mental health for children. And then coupling that with housing and the increased barriers to education that displacement causes, it just seemed like a really, good entry point for me to do the work that I wanted to do. And here I am.
We're glad all of you are here. You guys do amazing work, and it's so thank you. So we talked about this a little bit already, but with COVID changes, what do you think has been what is something else that we haven't talked about? Like, what is life like in shelter? You mentioned wearing masks, but what are some of the challenges our guests are facing with vaccines and access to vaccines and other things such as that?
I'm guessing that question's for me.
Yes, I'm sorry, to Emily.
Okay.
Yes, Emily.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, basically every step of the way, it's been different challenges, some that we could anticipate, like, the social distancing pieces, we could anticipate that might be a bit of a challenge when you have a bunch of people living together, some that we couldn't always anticipate. One of the things right now that we actually have basically solved, but up until recently it was an issue, was getting access to the vaccines, because it was being rolled out. There was a lot of conflict, even simple things like, oh, I want to get this vaccine, but I don't have a way to get over there, or I want to get this vaccine, but I work so that I can save up for an apartment so that I can move out of homelessness, but they don't have any clinics when I'm not working, things like that. We did recently have a vaccine clinic on site, so that's why I say that's been mostly resolved, because the people who wanted it, who didn't have access otherwise, were for the most part able to access it. There are still a few people that we're working with to help them get it. Yeah, just basically, I would say the biggest ones are those nitty gritty details, the really small things that you wouldn't expect, like someone's work schedule conflicting with a vaccine appointment.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Jasmine, how about you? What are some of the things like, I know there's been new resources available for housing and navigating those, but how easy are they to access, and what kinds of things has that brought up for you in your work?
Yeah, there's been kind of an incredible amount of, resources that have come into fruition over, the year that I've worked here. Mostly regarding, rent stabilization, back pay of rent, security deposit funding, which has all been fantastic. More administrative burden, but totally worth it. In order to, relieve some financial strain on someone who's just, entering being housed after being homeless. Yeah, I would say I would also echo Emily, just issues within, the vaccination kind of progress. I've noticed quite a lot of vaccine hesitancy, specifically kind of in the motels. So I think that will be a continuing issue for, the motel outreach team that we have, that COTS has, led for, I guess, maybe almost a year now. And just hearing from my clients, just a lot of hesitancy and, not true facts, I guess, things that, I know to be, completely false, but, it's hard for folks who are isolated within, the motels. Like I have to remember, they don't read the New York Times every morning for the past year, obsessively about every, development or every change or anything like that. So sometimes I think it's, we have to just kind of sit with them and, sometimes their concerns are so, easy to answer that they just, don't understand. But I think going forward, that will be a struggle for us to continue doing outreach within, those motel systems, because there are quite a lot of people who are still in the motels right now, unfortunately. But we'll see how that progresses as well over the next few months, with the summer and tourists coming and stuff like that.
Lots of changes. How about you, Fiona? What's it like? I mean, I understand, so people are wearing masks in family shelter. How does that work with children and with adults? And what does that look like? And the vaccine, and how's that been?
Yeah, so we've done a lot of collaborative work with the community health center. And so I think recently they're going directly to folks for vaccinations, which is wonderful. It helps to alleviate barriers like transportation or, unique work schedules and things like that. I think looking into the future, hopefully summer is going to be a big shift. So it'll be a lot of, adapting our policies and trying to provide like increased access for children for summer programming, summer learning, things of that nature. And there is a lot of funding going into that right now, which is really exciting.
Yeah.
So looking forward to a very different summer than last year.
That'll be nice. I think everyone is. So kind of looking at going a little broader now. So Emily, what changes would you, if you could, change anything in the community, what would you do? What would you like to see to reduce the number or minimize the impact upon people facing the crisis of homelessness here in Vermont?
Yeah, I think the main and first things I would want to do is increase the amount of housing, lower rent, raise how much people get paid for the jobs that they provide, the services that they provide, because those are really the biggest barriers for people moving out of homelessness. It seems quite often that, especially for a lot of people in the shelter, it feels like homelessness is a one-way direction where you hit the bottom and then it takes a long time to get back back up from there. And a lot of that is because either they're not making enough money, either there isn't a unit, or there's a unit, but it costs like, $1,800 for a studio apartment, which I have seen often when I'm trying to help people find places that they can apply to. So that is what I would do, especially because there's a lot of dignity that is given to people who have housing that gets taken away when you don't have it. And there's not a lot that helps restore that dignity. So I would also like to see other things like that. And I know I mentioned earlier, like places people can go during the day where they aren't asked to leave or asked to move along, because, you don't sometimes even have the dignity of having a place that you can spend your time. So things like that.
Those are good things. Jasmine, how about you? What changes would you like to see?
Yeah, I would just again echo Emily. I would say the number one issue that the community has been facing is just a severe lack of housing available. For most folks right now, it's not even an issue of not having vouchers or subsidies or programs or anything like that because of with COVID, there's been quite a lot of funding. There was a CARES vouchers program, and we have a ton of clients right now who have CARES vouchers who can use those for the next year, but they do have a time limit for when they must lease up before the voucher expires. And the issue is, I know with a lot of families in the shelter too, who have CARES vouchers, they have these vouchers, but there's nowhere for them to use them. I can even, speak to it myself. I recently looked for a new apartment, and I even started to feel panicked and frustrated, like where are all the apartments? There's just none available. When I would contact one, I would be the fifth person who had called in the last hour. So the shortage is just ridiculous at this point. And it's easy to say maybe people can look out in Essex or even to Winooski or look further south, but for people who work downtown, sometimes public transportation will work for them, but not always. There's a lot of times where they need to just be in the Burlington area if that's where their services are, if that's where they get methadone, or that's where they have to go every day to work, or to see their therapist. For any number of reasons, it becomes difficult for them to kind of be able to, go out towards other cities. So yeah, that's just been a huge issue recently for us within the HRC, is trying to find units for people who, even are in the best situation possible. Because, historically it would be the issue is, there's not enough vouchers, there's not enough subsidies, there's not enough support for these folks. But now we have all these people matched up with all these resources, but there's just nowhere for them to use them.
Wow. How about you, Fiona? What changes would you like to see?
Yeah, again, I think we're all coming back to the availability of housing.
Yeah.
I wish I knew the average length of time that families are in family shelter, but I think that sometimes people think that it's just this quick transitional space for you to sleep for a short period of time until you get permanent housing. But we've had families here for over a year easily. And a number of families that are here for, at least like an entire school year. And just like Jasmine said, it's not because of like a lack of vouchers or economic support. It's really a lack of housing. And then when you add into that barriers, like potentially having a large family, a lot of people to support, requiring a certain number of bedrooms, things like that. The availability just like continues to reduce, and particularly with the CARES voucher, it expires in 1 year. So, while the voucher might enable a family to get an apartment that's a certain price, it might not be something that they can afford after that year. So that's a tremendous barrier. Transportation is another really big one. So McKinney-Vento is a piece of legislation that protects children experiencing homelessness, and it enables kids to stay in their school district while they're experiencing homelessness, which looks like, the district providing transportation. So like if someone is living out in Essex while they're experiencing homelessness, but their former school was in Burlington, then they can continue to receive transportation. But that doesn't exist for after school. And so that's also been a tremendous barrier where, especially with, remote learning or a hybrid learning schedule where kids are only going to school certain days of the week, without having access to after school, it creates a shorter workday and increased need for child supervision. And then or no transportation. And really after school is incredibly important as, for supporting children through learning loss that they've experienced and, having a space for connection and friendship building that exists outside of shelter. And so lack of housing, lack of transportation, those are really big barriers that I would like to see addressed. And increased language access services too. The multilingual language liaison program through the Burlington School District is phenomenal, and provides families who are English learners with language liaisons that support them through the entire school year. So, and really provide solid support. And I would love to see an increase in services like that, where we're actually able to employ multilingual folks to support their community.
Awesome. One of Fiona, to touch on one of the things you brought up and that all of you had touched on was a few years ago we had a mom who was staying at the Firehouse Family Shelter with COTS, and she had agreed very graciously to do an interview and talk about her experience at COTS. But she said we offered, well, if to make that easier for you, we can provide the transportation. And so I was, I was being her chauffeur for the day. And so I picked her up at Firehouse and we had her child with us, got the car seat in, and then we took her child to daycare. And then we were doing the interview. So while we were going along, she was kind of telling me about her life. And the issue is that she had an apartment. She showed me where we went past where the apartment was going to be. But for her to find it, she didn't have a car, so she had to find an apartment on public transportation where she could also have childcare and she could also get to work and her apartment. And so she was talking about all of these things and she wasn't complaining. It was just a matter of fact. And I asked her how long the process that we had just done to take her child to childcare and to get to her job would have taken her if I hadn't driven her. And she said, oh, it's like a 2-hour trip, with all the transfers and everything. And I was like,
yeah,
back and forth, and it was literally across town. It wasn't that far. And she wasn't complaining. It just was. She said it was just, and she just referenced that when it was icy, it was harder because then she'd slip on the ice trying to carry everything with her child. And I was like, anyway, it was an awareness of how much harder everything is just in that with transportation and housing and childcare and education.
Right. That's a really important point. I just want to correct what I said earlier. So transportation is not available for after school, but it's also not available for daycare. So until kids are preschool age, there is no transportation. And with reduced childcare hours and impact on staffing that the pandemic has had, it means that there's just a reduced availability of childcare centers that are further and further away, not necessarily in families' neighborhoods. And yeah, we had a family also at Firehouse who didn't have transportation to daycare. And there were several days where she wasn't able to go because it was so cold over the winter. And it required her traveling down an incredibly steep hill that just, it's not safe to bring a stroller down an icy steep. Yeah.
That's exactly what the mom was talking about, the icy steep hill with a stroller. How hard that was.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, that's talk about conversations that you will never forget. It was just, there have been several, but that was one of them.
Yeah.
Well, I want to be conscious of time. So we're nearing the end of our time together. And I'm so grateful to all of you for taking this time today. So I want my final question today, one of the things, I mean, I just, before I ask you my final question, some of the themes, we have used some of those frontline documentaries in the past to try to help people when they have questions about that. And one of the things I find interesting is this frontline documentary, Growing Up Poor in America, was filmed in Ohio, but we've shown ones from California and New York and rural Kansas, and the thing that I'm always touched that the themes are the same. That even though there might be slight differences depending where you are in the country or your experience, or whether you're a single adult or a family. I'm the themes that came up for me in this particular documentary were the anxiety, about the present, about the future, mental health issues, depression, concern about your parents, the scarcity, that living paycheck to paycheck, and which bill are you going to pay and how are you going to make those choices? How much harder it is for children who are experiencing homelessness on top of everything else, for academic challenges and access. Food, was critical, like the access to food and the cost of food and the utilities, that these are, the wages and benefits and being able to, how you do that. And so I think that was one of the things that I found really powerful in this, and that how COVID just made all those inequities even more so, just intensified them. It didn't, just didn't alleviate that. So if you haven't watched the documentary, I highly recommend checking it out. It's really quite powerful. And there was an interview also where there's a link on our Facebook page. We'll share it on our website as well, with the filmmaker who talked about it, which is really interesting about how they made the movie, and what happened. They didn't plan to make a movie during the pandemic. It just happened that's what happened. They were planning it, and then a pandemic happened. But one of the quotes from the filmmaker about it, because he's a father himself, he said, because the documentary is through the eyes of children, is we listen to kids, but we often don't really hear them. And so I thank you all for sharing that, because I think what you've shared today is it's given a reminder to hear the voices of the people in our community. So with my final question to all of you, I'll go in the same circle again. Emily first. Looking ahead, what's coming that most excites you? What's next at COTS for you that you are saying, oh, I can't wait for that to happen. I'm excited about that.
Yeah, I think it's very similar to what pretty much everyone in the entire world at this point is excited about, but we are beginning to talk about transitioning out of the pandemic response. So we're still in the very early stages. Very likely there will be a lot of unforeseen things that we couldn't have accounted for or planned for, but I am very excited to take that opportunity to reflect on what we've been doing and how, and make sure that it fits a post-pandemic world better than it did before.
I love that. I love that. How about you, Jasmine? What's excited that what you're looking forward to?
I'm excited for, more housing to be built. That will make my life easier, I think, for everyone within the entire organization and the whole community. But COTS has been doing some partnerships with Summit Property Management. So they're building, these gorgeous brand new apartment complexes, as many cities are these days. But they have been setting aside, 5-ish units for COTS clients specifically. We just had that with the new Casavant building in Winooski. So we have some clients there, and I just think they're building another one across the street, which we'll be able to identify COTS clients for. And I'm excited to be able to have clients go into a brand new stunning, apartment building. I think it's an opportunity that most clients aren't able to take. And so that really excites me. There's been a few buildings that have been built by other community members that COTS clients have gone into. Juniper House is a new building by Cathedral Square right on the water, which is also stunning. We've had quite a few clients go in there. And then Susan's Place as well is a building project in Essex Junction that CHT kind of speared a few months ago, and that's full of formerly homeless clients. So I don't remember the number, but I think it was somewhere around 40, 50 households all went in. So that was really incredible to see that many people come off of the coordinated entry master list and go into a new building. So I'm really excited for more projects like that.
Nice. How about you, Fiona? What are you excited or looking forward to?
I think that your comment about the film and the role that youth play made me think of that. I'm really excited for advocacy that is happening at the state level right now for to create a youth council so that youth can participate in very important decisions that impact them, and they can be they can have a seat at the table where those decisions are made. So I'm really looking forward to that. I participated in a few like Zoom meetings with youth in the community where questions were asked like, what is your experience with remote learning? What are the barriers? What changes would you like to see? And the youth, they have the most valuable perspective because they are experiencing it firsthand. So that's a really big one. Also looking forward to advocacy for universal after school so that all children can be provided with after school free of charge. And I'm really hoping that that includes transportation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Since that is the number one barrier that I've witnessed. And then I think I'm also inspired by what Jasmine mentioned, and looking forward to reflecting on the ways that we have had to adapt through the pandemic, the community partnerships that have evolved through this, and thinking about ways that we can use that learning to adapt our systems and improve. So I'm really looking forward to that.
Well, that is, and we're just now at noon, so I think that is a perfect place to close our conversation today. Thank you, Emily and Jasmine and Fiona. You guys were amazing, and I hope everyone enjoyed this conversation to learn a little bit more about COTS and about what COTS has been like in the time of COVID as well. If you have any further questions, feel free to reach out to us at info@cotsonline.org. Follow us on Facebook or other social media, Instagram and Twitter. And we hope you all will join us for the COTS Walk, which is Sunday, May 2nd. And we're still a little ways from our goal. So if anyone would like to join or make a donation, we would be grateful for your support. Thank you, all of you. And thank you all for your work. And we're grateful. So, all right. Have a great day. And I will thank you all soon. I'll see you all soon. All right.
See you later.
Bye.